7:35 as before? Yes. As normal, as normal.
Well, the trouble is it's never normal. 2 successive days.
Whenever they give me 2 minutes, I will. Run the clock, please, love. We are recording. And we have 50 seconds. Huh. 30 seconds. It isn't a very good idea anyway, is it? Firing line number 3. Nine, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Once again, as is the custom 2 or 3 times a year, Firing Line adapts its format so as to give the advantage to several interrogators who may wish to catalyze my wisdom or tax me with my sins. On this occasion, we shall hear from 3 accomplished British journalists on the general theme, questions about America. There are presumably not many such questions that Mr. Lewis Heren doesn't have the answer to, or if not, this is a good time to ask why, since he is foreign editor of the Times and has served as chief of its bureau in Washington. His schooling was in London, and he began with the Times in 1933 and has served as foreign correspondent in New Delhi, in the Middle East, Korea, Singapore, and Bonn. Miss D. Wells was born in Rhode Island, but came to England in 1953. She has written here very widely for The Guardian, for the Sunday Express. She has freelanced for the New York Times. Most recently, she has turned to the novel and is the author of the novel Jane. Mr. Anthony Howard is the editor of the New Statesman, the leading left-oriented, or as they say in these parts, left-orientated weekly journal of opinion in England. He was educated at Westminster and Christchurch, Oxford, where he was president of the Oxford Union and chairman of the University Labour Club. He was Washington correspondent for The Observer between 1966 and 1969 and is the author of The Making of the Prime Minister, published in 1965. Gentlemen, Miss Wells, the program is yours.
Mr. Buckley, first I'd like to say it's a pleasure to meet an articulate spokesman of the right, most unusual in both our countries. Are you suggesting it doesn't happen often? And alas, I think we ought to start with Watergate. Now, it would seem to me that Watergate became inevitable once your brand of American conservatism and the economy which it nurtures took control. Would you agree with that one?
No, I wouldn't. It seems to me that my brand of conservatism is devoted to the proposition that government shouldn't be so powerful as to seduce the ugly instincts of people who want to control governments. If ours were the exiguous thing we would like to see, it would hardly have been worth their while to go in for such activities as they have gone into.
Well, the concentration of power in the White House, we all know, started with Roosevelt, or even with Theodore before.
Well, it started with Alexander Hamilton, if you want to play the historical game.
No,
but there are those who have resisted, who have been conservatives, and those who have not resisted its enhancement, who have been the liberals.
No, but it seems to me that in recent years, since Mr. Nixon went into the White House, that you've had this drive towards monopoly power, which you have in business. It's been dressed by public relations, just as in the big corporate world of the United States. and much more. There's this ruthlessness. There's also this sort of moral rectitude, this conviction that the American conservative knows what's best and what's right for his country, which seems to have led to Watergate.
Well, you can call it ruthlessness, you can call it conviction. Of one thing I can assure you, which is that the preoccupation with power is much more lackadaisical on the part of Mr. Nixon than it was, say, from Lyndon Johnson, or even than John Kennedy. The flackery that surrounded John Kennedy cannot be compared in quality or in intensity to the rather unprofessional performance of Mr. Nixon. And of course, FDR is our first great president, great in the sense of totally concerned with the exercise of power. You may remember that at one point he thought to abolish the Supreme Court or make it, in effect, supererogatory. That kind of thing Mr. Nixon has not gone in for. Maybe it hasn't occurred to him, but in fact he hasn't done it.
Let me pick you up on one word.
Sure.
You said in quality or intensity.
Yeah.
Is your complaint against the people who surrounded Mr. Nixon, they weren't sort of nice right-wing gents, that they were apparatchiks of a different breed from yourself?
I was talking about the flackery.
Oh, the factory.
The flackery.
Oh, the flackery.
I don't know whether you use that word here.
Yes, we do use the word. Yes,
yeah.
But you said they were different in quality.
The bards who surrounded John Kennedy and made every gesture of his appear to be something that should be memorialized in museums and things, were people of the quality of Schlesinger and Galbraith.
Henry Kissinger?
And so on.
And Henry Kissinger and Nixonian...
No, Kissinger never went in for that kind of thing.
And of course he was never that close to Kennedy.
Yeah,
And he was never that close to Kennedy.
No, I was saying about now.
But in the case of Mr. Nixon, you know, he has depended really sort of on conscripts to do that kind of thing, and there is noticeable difference, don't you think, in the quality. Leaving aside the question of the raw material, but it seems to me the people who are as narcissistic as it is alleged Nixon is, simply haven't paid what you would expect to be a corresponding amount of attention to their own image by paying for, you know, Galbraith-type bards.
No, let's go behind the imagery.
Sir?
I say let's go behind or beyond the imagery.
Sure.
Now, with Roosevelt and with Johnson, the two Democratic presidents you mentioned, of course they were concerned with power, but they did play with it within a recognized bounds. I mean, they accepted the fact that the Congress was
I don't think so at
a
all.
co-equal branch, but they did.
Oh, but I assure you they did not.
Well, look,
in fact, they tried to pack, we just went over the Supreme Court. He tried to pack the Supreme Court. Lyndon Johnson was the greatest bully that Congress ever experienced. Nixon's trouble is the inattention that he gives to Congress. Lyndon Johnson desired to dominate Congress, and he was known as the greatest arm twister in the history of the United States.
Fine, he tried to dominate it, but he tried to dominate it within the framework and experience of
domination.
American
He
government.
tried to dominate.
That's right, he didn't shoot anybody. That's what you mean.
He tried to
whereas-
dominate because he thought it was important. And the trouble with Mr. Nixon is that he doesn't think that Congress or any other branch of government but himself is important. The reason why Lyndon Johnson cajoled and seduced and bullied and all these kind of things, because he thought there was power in those corridors.
Well, if this much is true, of course, Mr. Howard, that during the season when Mr. Lyndon Johnson desired the passage of a whole series of legislative quote reforms, he had to get them passed by Congress, otherwise they wouldn't exist as law. But in his conduct of foreign affairs, he was every bit as imperious as Richard Nixon, and it would not have occurred to him to consult
Come, there's not an equation there even. You and I may think, or I may think, that Mr. Johnson got the congressional approval for Vietnam by a trick. But he knew that he had to have that piece of paper, that Gulf of Tonkin resolution, in his pocket.
Oh, but
now let's look at what Mr. Nixon did about Cambodia. He just not only didn't tell them, he told them lies. He thought they could be ignored and disregarded, and therefore, even before the defense committees, he pretended that he wasn't doing what he was doing.
Well,
it's a quite different relationship of President to Congress between
Mr. Howard, your
Lyndon...
memory is a little leaky.
Well, come on,
because
tell me where the
the
holes
Tonkin
are.
resolution does not mention Vietnam.
It does not.
mentions action in that area,
Of course.
which is Indochina. And under the circumstances,
now-
Cambodia is comprehended by the authority of the Tonkin resolution.
Now, Mr. Buckley, I think we've got to level with you. Everybody's being very polite and pussyfooting around, but this isn't really what we meant to talk about. In fact, what has happened...
You call this pussyfooting?
Yes. In fact, what has happened has been a very, very serious moral breakdown in which criminal acts were committed either with or without the knowledge of the president, but certainly among the group that was very, very close to him. And he even yet doesn't seem to grasp the importance of this as almost
I agree with you.
Almost a mortal blow at the morality of America. Moreover, there have been things that I think have shocked if I may put it this way, even you, the enemies list, the lies, the absolute flat-faced lies that have been told, not only about the bombing of Cambodia, but also before, when the Washington Post was...
I love the innocence with which you concentrate on lies as though they were unusual. Your prime minister over here lied about Suez, Kennedy lied about Cuba, Roosevelt lied about the deals he'd made with Churchill, Churchill lied about deals he made with Stalin. Unfortunately, it seems to be a commonplace rather than anything unusual. Now, I continue to disapprove of it, but I refuse to say that there is a particularized disapproval that attaches only to Nixon. This is the unfortunate character of much of the criticism of Mr. Nixon. It holds him out as uniquely guilty. Which
No, I wouldn't think for a minute, except that in the extreme gravity of this situation, I don't think you can think of another president, even going back as far as the other one who was almost impeached was, what, Andrew Jackson. I don't think there's ever been a scandal of this size before.
Well, no, I think that's quite true.
Right. Now, how far do you...
Whether in the perspective of history, we will think of it as a sort of a Titus Oates scandal.
Well, we haven't yet got there, Mr. Buckley. As a matter of fact, we haven't really got to the bottom of this yet.
For just a moment, Titus Oates was not the Prime Minister of Britain at the time. I think
No, but if it hadn't been for Lord Shaftesbury, the whole business really wouldn't have been very significant, would it?
Yeah, but we have to come back to the business, I think, of extremism. It is true that the heads of government lie from time to time. It is true that heads of government try to screw their opposition. It is true that they wield power in very curious ways, but there's always been some kind of limit before. People have
The Tower of London was the limit before.
No, we're talking about modern, fairly modern politics. And I think this is what is the really shocking thing, whether it's Mr. Nixon or a member of his entourage, saw that there was no limit, that there was no case for moderation, no case for the normal disciplines which apply among communities.
Well, now, do you really think that's true? Because surely they recognized, I'm talking about the bad guys now, surely they recognized that a limit was exposure. People who are truly ruthless don't mind that their methods should be exposed. But these people went to extraordinary, and as it turns out to be rather maladroit, measures to avoid being seen.
It depends also.
Therefore, they recognize that the ethic was against them.
If you say people who are truly ruthless...
That's right, exactly.
Against being found out. Well, there's no real moral credit in that.
Oh, no, I think in a truly totalitarian society or in a despotic society, you simply do what you want and say that the safety of the state justifies
That's
it.
not the kind of society we're talking about. And in fact, the laws in America, and this group of people who now form the administration were very hot on the law and order stuff when they came in. Mr. Mitchell, who's now been indicted on several charges, was a very firm law and order man. Now, these people were obviously dishonest to a degree. This is what I want to establish, that we've never known before, and has shaken the American people.
Well, are you talking about the people who are in jail, or people you anticipate will soon be in jail because you have arrived at conclusions about their guilt?
No, I'm only talking about the things that exist, either the people that are in jail,
you're talking
or
about
people,
Howard Hart and
people who've
Liddy
been
and the
indicted.
Cubans.
I think it's...
Well, they've been given 35-year sentences. I should think the time... I mean, maybe if we import a Greek colonel, we can give them a remitted sentence in due course. But let's not proceed on the assumption let's not proceed on the assumption that John Mitchell is guilty.
No, but he has been indicted. I didn't assume he was guilty.
He's been indicted for something that has nothing whatever to do with what we've been talking about. But if you want to get into the heart of a fire insurance company, I will. Well,
exactly. I mean, there are so many fronts and levels on which these people have now been exposed. And you say that in a more ruthless people wouldn't mind being exposed.
You know what I think? Because I think you'd be interested, really. I think that there is a shifting perspective in America, and maybe the same thing will happen in England in due course, as a result of an alienation on the part of the intellectuals concerning executive power. By this I mean that the great disillusionment that was triggered by Vietnam burst a dream to which most intellectuals in America had subscribed, that the White House was the solvent of a general idealism. And under the circumstances, we now see as reprehensible the kind of thing that we simply accepted routinely. And when stories were told about the exercise by FDR of deals involving farmers or businessmen or whatever, we thought it was rather slick and amusing. Now we find it rather perfidious.
I don't think it was
I prefer
only...
the latter to the former interpretation, and have been consistent about it, but I do think it is this dislodged ethic that has caused this rather ravenous interest.
But it was never only intellectuals, Mr. Buckley, who were hoping against evidence,
Mostly.
against hope, that the White House was essentially administered by honest, honorable men. I think
No, I'm not talking about the quality of the people who occupy the White House. I'm talking about the function. People like Clinton Rossiter and people like Professor whatchamacallit, the guy who was the great bar of the presidency, thought of it as the central focus of idealistic enthusiasm in America.
Well, there's a good historic
the great
reason.
moral paradigm.
Well, there's a good historic reason for that, because as we know, one reason why FDR was so successful, why he was elected and re-elected so often, was because the American system seemed to have broken down, that people turned to the White House for initiatives that they, which Congress was supposed to provide, but which failed to do so.
There's no question about it, but they turned to Hitler for initiative in another country at about the same time. They turned to Perón in another country 20 years later, and Mussolini 10 years earlier. The fact that people turn to the executive for inspiration does not mean that that the best people think of it as the fountainhead of true
Yes, but the
idealism.
three things you have mentioned were not democratic countries by any means. As a matter of fact, they earned
They were democratic when Hitler was
the
elected.
loathing of the entire world. I wouldn't wish this on America. But you have said that you think that the president should not be impeached, that it would do infinitely more damage to the country and to the electorate.
That's my opinion.
It is. How far would a president have to go before you would think that it was necessary for him to be impeached?
Up to the point of convincing the people that he should be removed.
Well,
not
only
that he should be
25%
punished.
now in America seem to think that Mr. Nixon is innocent of all charges.
I know, but if you notice, the interesting figure is not how many people think he's innocent. Practically nobody does, at least completely innocent. Only about 25, 30%. But how many people think he should be removed? And the answer is only 18%.
Yes, I think this demonstrates once more the basic shrewdness of the American people. That's why it's a society that will survive.
I think so.
Obviously, the
For
country
instance,
has to be
for
governed.
instance, if the Queen, say, were involved in a scandal, and many people thought, let's say, about her what they thought about King Edward VIII, the fact that they thought he was not, let's say, in his case, an exemplar as head of the church here, did not lead them to the assumption that he should be removed, right? And there is a sense in which a parallel can be drawn, I think, between the sovereign here.
But now the
and
reason that
president
many
there.
people don't want to see the president impeached is, I would think, on the part of the Democratic Party, political expediency, and on the part of many other people in either party, the worry that Mr. Agnew might take over.
Yeah, there's all of that.
But now, with this extraordinary number of fronts that the Republicans are fighting on, there's even the possibility that Mr. Agnew won't be there for his full term.
So your question is?
So my question is, do you think that if Mr. Agnew were to go, that then there might be a movement to impeach?
Well, I suppose if they nominated Teddy Kennedy as vice president, there'd be a considerably changed opinion about impeachment. But on the whole, I think it's a fear of the process.
But you haven't told me yet the circumstances in which you think a president should be removed. Just how criminal would a president have to be?
Well, if the removal of the president was the important factor, then I think he should be impeached and convicted instantly. But to say that he should be impeached because you have identified him as the malefactor of a particular act of misdemeanor is not, in my opinion, sufficient.
But do you
cause.
think it is right that
No, it's not right at all.
No, but a large country like America should go along under a president, not necessarily this one, but some hypothetical president, whom everyone knew to be guilty of criminal activities?
Again, it depends on the quality of the crime.
Well, this is the line I want you to draw. Mr. Ehrlichman wouldn't draw the
Very
line.
hard to draw. It's very hard to draw, and I choose not to do it in the abstract.
Murder?
Well, there again, you get into, for instance, let me give you an example. Winston Churchill speaking in America in 1949, spoke certain words that could easily be interpreted as hoping that the career of Stalin would end the way the careers of some tyrants, other tyrants notoriously have. Now, under certain circumstances, you might say he was guilty of promoting, quotes, murder. There's certain activities of which we know de Gaulle was quote guilty that involved assassination of terrorists, OAS types, and so on and so forth.
No, I think to wish that someone were not to be any longer the head of a state is not necessarily to wish for that person's murder, but I'm trying to pin you down to say exactly when you think that it would be better for a country to get rid of its president rather than be led by...
Well, you won't succeed beyond my effort to appease you, I should say, not satisfy you abstractly. Because,
do you think such a president...
all situations, I think, have to be considered in the light of the situation.
Indeed. But do you think such a president can lead such an enormously powerful and important country as America face to face with leaders of other governments throughout the world?
Manifestly. In the first place, there's always, you can always go back to tu quoque, and I can't think of any country in the world, I suppose I better be polite and say with the exception of your own, concerning whom you can't say, do you really want to get into this particular glass house and start throwing stones? Take the situation in Germany. As I understand it, two guys were bribed, as a result of which Willy Brandt is now the prime minister. We don't even know who they are. And now it turns out that there is not even a law against bribing legislators in Germany. So that, you can go right down the list. It's an invidious thing to do. But if absolutely necessary, you can do it. I think that Mr. Nixon suffers primarily from what I once referred to as his curdling sanctimony. It is hard to take from him because he uses so cloyingly a rhetoric that suggests his adherence to standards that are really otherworldly. But as regards choosing between him and any other leader I can think of, I would certainly as soon trust him as anybody I can think of offhand.
Mr. Buckley,
Mr. Wilson?
I want to take you on the personal level. From what I've read of you over the past 9 months, I found it extremely entertaining because for the first time I've seen you on the defensive. And when I used to watch you in the States, it seemed to me that it was your job always to be the aggressor in most arguments, to be the gadfly. You did it very eloquently and very nimbly. Now, it seems to me from reading you that over the past 8 months, you've been having to all the time sort of backpedal, protect your flank. You've come up and said, well, I don't believe in impeachment, but I think he should be slapped on the wrist, he should be censured. I think is your solution to this imbroglio.
Why is that defensive?
Well, it seems to me it's kind of halfway house, a compromise house that you've reached.
Excuse me, but after all, I'm an Agnew enthusiast. I'd be a much happier man with Mr. Agnew as president than Mr. Nixon. So it's hardly defensive for me to say something contrary to my own personal interests.
Yeah, but can I take you further on this, though? That
sure.
I always thought that the position of the right in America was that some way they were morally superior. They didn't get up to the kind of things that dirty Democrats did in big city politics. You didn't find right-wing people in America saying, I'll vote every grave in the city.
No, I don't think that's true.
I think it was an impression.
Well, that's how Republicans have long seen themselves. And the sufficient literature and evidence around to prove that.
I really don't think so. I'm a very close student of attitudes of American right, and I don't think they say that.
You wouldn't see
I think they say this, that there is this difference between them and the Democrats as regards the treatment and the apprehension of criminals and court procedure and that kind of thing. We're sort of hawkish on it and the others are sort of permissive. But I've never heard a conservative say
hawkish.
The breed of conservatives is less disposed to corruption than the breed of liberals. I've never seen that.
Well, I think you've had a sheltered acquaintanceship.
Yes, I think, Mr. Buckley, you're being disingenuous
You've had a very sheltered acquaintanceship.
It was established
I hope you will cite some American who has said that. Quite the contrary, I tend to feel that conservatives, that the liberals in government are much more ideological than conservatives and therefore want power for the sake of power more, and under the circumstances are probably much less easily bribed than, say, Republicans. The use of money for the purpose of bribery, I should think, is much more a Republican than a Democratic sin nationally. For the acquisition of power, it's more democratic sin.
No, you can go back to Lord Bryce's book, The American Commonwealth, and he produces the evidence there that Republicans see themselves as WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and that they do have this high moral approach. It is they who take care of the schools. It is they who take care of government, whereas the Democrats are the mucky Irish and the ethnics, and also the party that's always leading the country into war. And this has been going on for a long, long time. I'm surprised that you're even trying to defend it.
Yeah,
I think it has got to do with it, because I think that the shock which I'm trying to get from you was that this came not from greedy liberals for power, but it came from the courtiers of the time of a right-wing president who you said just now is sanctimonious and you can't bear that bit. And this should have been, I think it's reflected, if I may say so, in your writing. The élan has gone. That somehow we are now trying to, not with our whole heart, but we're trying to justify as best we can, drawing comparisons with what Senator Kennedy may or may not have done, and try to say, well, you shouldn't condemn one without the other. And the whole thing has been a gallant rearguard action. But haven't you found it much more difficult yourself to play the role that you used to be able to play in this new climate?
Not in the least. I think I was the least surprised man in America when this kind of thing happened.
Do you not find it baffling, though, Mr. Buckley, that America, which has always prided itself on being a moral, Puritan, God-fearing society, and these people...
You're a couple hundred years out of date.
Not really, no. People who wear shoes and eat every day and have the benefit of the kind of republic that America is and go to decent schools and are brought up not in conditions of deprivation but in ordinary, nice families, like many of the people who've been involved in the Watergate thing. Do you not find their moral blurring, their easily corruptible ways a bit baffling in view of our background?
Not really, no.
No.
No, I find it, it's cause for despondency, and it's certainly cause for renewed
but
efforts.
what did Mom tell them? What Boy Scout troop did they belong to? What did they learn in their civics class in high school? What did they learn at Yale?
The answer is not nearly enough. The answer is not nearly enough.
But why? With all that money, all that advantage, all that telling the rest of the world about how everything's bigger and better and absolutely guaranteed here in America. And
I'll tell you.
Right.
In part because they grew up, many of them, in a season in which people were encouraged, you may remember, to decide on their own what laws to obey and which to disregard.
When was this season?
During the 60s, and in part because they
But
grew
those
up
were
in a
campus
society whose
bombs.
professors are pretty well addicted to the notion that truth is relative.
Oh, come on.
And
Now,
this has been a raging disease throughout the century, not just through the 60s.
Indeed, but the guys that we're talking about were not the ones that you are now trying to talk about, which is the dissidents, the anti-war.
I give you Jeb Stuart Magruder, who studied ethics under the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, Jr., who was indicted for breaking the law.
You couldn't give me Jeb
said
Stuart Magruder gift wrapped.
What? That won't work with me as well.
No.
I give you him not gift wrapped, but as an example of the kind of person who studied ethics during the 60s under somebody who preached civil disobedience.
Mr. Buckley, let's get back to my original question. Now, we've agreed that power has flowed to the White House since at least the early 30s onwards. Now, we have a situation where that power has been wielded in a very extreme, perhaps criminal way. Now, why is this? Is this because of the conservatism you so ably represent?
No, I think it's in part the collapse of Congress at a point in American history when the economic problem was foremost in people's minds, with the result that it never regained.
Do you think it was the collapse of
preeminence.
Congress that sent people into the Watergate to burglar it? Do you
No,
think
I was answering Mr. Heron's question, not whatever came into your mind.
I don't think it is an answer.
It may be an insufficient answer, but it's the only answer I have.
I see.
I was asked, why was there this accumulation of power? To which I answered, or was beginning to answer, that there was a vacuum created by the collapse and demoralization of Congress when it became simply a ratifying body for the President of the United States during the first term. Slowly it did regain some power, but never fully, with the result that each president has successively been stronger than the last, has commanded more billions of dollars to spend, a larger staff in the White House, and so on. And I'm very glad to see a reversal in this. But, as I say, I think that the distinctive furies that have been unleashed at the expense of Mr. Nixon are in part the result of a dislodged ethic. And that under the circumstances in the future, we will really look at Watergate merely as a catalyst, and a very welcome one
But
at
what
that.
do you think dislodged that ethic?
The failure of liberal utopianism.
You think that?
Yeah.
Cross your heart.
Now, come, Mr. Buckley. Now, there are plenty of
You want a lie detector test, huh?
Look, there are plenty of sound Republicans who will agree with you on that one, but would have not gone to the extremes of Mr. Nixon and his men.
No, I agree. I don't know how to put it if I don't say that I think that people like Dean are despicable. But I am simply less surprised than you apparently are that occasionally people like that find themselves in a situation of power. Maybe one reason is that people in America, and I suspect to a certain extent in England, are less offended by rhetorical abuses than maybe I am, and for some reason have, I think, rather an old lady's horror at abuses that are technical infractions rather than non-technical infractions.
We're not talking about just technical infractions, though. We're talking about a group of people who chose to break
No, but
the
it's
law.
technically an infraction.
Right.
I'm using a generic term.
Well, that's
I mean,
pretty...
murder is a technical infraction, too.
Indeed, indeed. Well, that's making, yes, technology, yes.
I'm trying to follow you on this. You say it would be a catalyst, and you think it may be a good thing. What do you see as the end product? A nice kind of cynical right-wing attitude, that's what these things go on, that's the way the cookie crumbles, who should be surprised, let's all understand this is what politicians get up to. Does your antipathy of the liberal dream take you that far, that you want people to believe that politics is a dirty game?
Yeah, pretty much so. I want a transfusion of skepticism, so that every time one listens to a Richard Nixon or a George McGovern, or the local guy who's going to run for mayor of New York and turn it into the Empire City, that people look at him with the kind of skepticism that distinguished the Yankee of the 19th century. And I want, under the circumstances, to undo, to the extent that it's possible to do so, the kind of utopianism that has worked its way into politics during the last century and ushered in the worst century in human experience.
What do you think would happen if your country found itself with that kind of mood and it found itself in a real emergency? America has always been able to dabble in other people's wars, but if we have your kind of population with their kind of
do we now
views-
call it other people's wars?
Yeah, I think we call it other
You mean Charles Lindbergh was right?
Well, but no, the point I'm making is it wasn't their own domestic war. Now, if you get this kind of wonderfully worldly wise population of your country that you're looking for, supposing something goes suddenly very wrong, there is some national crisis of the kind, if you like, we had in Britain in 1940. Do you think that they'll all suddenly all say, we stand together, we share values, we actually are moved by some spirit that's collective to all of us?
Well, to be skeptical is not necessarily to be iconoclastic, and I distinguish between the two.
You use the word skeptical. You accepted originally the word cynical from me. I said, is that what you want? And
No,
I think,
no,
well,
I
isn't
prefer
that your stock in
skeptical.
trade?
I prefer skeptical.
You wouldn't?
I prefer skeptical. I think Americans and English, and the English, can distinguish between pseudo-crises and genuine crises, and can be expected to. The whole business about I will not fight for king or country actually evaporated, we all know, when England was really up against it. I should hope the same would be true in America.
But do you ever feel that you're out to, well, you are out to destroy liberal idealism?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what do you want to put in its place? Just skepticism?
No, of course not. Skepticism isn't a faith, it's an attitude.
Yeah.
What I think belongs in there is a much more realistic idea of the uses of government and the limitations of government, and under the circumstances, a reintroduction by people of the notion that they are primarily responsible themselves.
I'm all right,
they
Jack.
and their friends and their family.
What we call I'm all right, Jack.
Human, excuse me?
What we call over here, I'm all right, Jack. That they're responsible for
No,
themselves.
it doesn't mean that they're all right.
Well,
they may be all wrong, but the notion that the
Looking after number
Democratic
one.
Party can settle the problems that you have with your wife or with your employer or with your hospital or...
what about the problems with your black neighbours?
Excuse me?
What about the problems with your black neighbours? Nothing to do with political action?
Well, I think that it is the function of government. It has no other function than to guarantee human rights. And to the extent that people's rights have been abused, or that they have been deprived of them because they're black, I see no other function for government than to step in precisely in moments of that kind.
You don't see any function for government at all in the health of a country? The maintaining people who are weaker and poorer than us and with no chance of living decently?
Very limited.
Very limited?
Very limited,
Like,
yeah.
what do you mean limited?
Well, I believe in what we Catholics call the doctrine of subsidiarity.
What does that mean?
It means that no public agency should undertake a job that a private agency can do, and no higher public agency should undertake a job that a lower public agency.
But do you not see or ever worry or feel that this might mean that now in America, for instance, doctors and hospitals are enormously expensive and most people can't afford them. And the health of a country, just as the education of a country, you do believe in public schools.
Yes, but I don't believe that there's a federal role for public schools, nor was there up until, what, 8, 9 years ago. I don't believe that there isn't a responsibility by those who have to take care of those who have not. I'm questioning the role of the government as an intermediary.
I see. But how are we going to persuade these people to do it if it is not by law?
How you persuade them anyway in a democratic society? It's a process of auto-taxation. If we have a democratic society, and the democratic society says let's have federalized medicine, it means the people are voting to tax themselves. Why can't you use the same impulses to give away the money voluntarily?
You wouldn't stop, because it wouldn't happen.
Why? Well, then repeal democracy.
Now, Mr. Buckley, you know, you surprise me because you're espousing some 19th century ideals.
Yes,
I think he surprises even himself.
And,
I'm not embarrassed by the 19th century. I think some of those brilliant political insights were born there, and unfortunately buried soon.
I agree with you, but the fact remains is that Mr. Hoover had the same ideas, and he brought your country to the brink of ruin.
Oh, come on. He didn't bring our country to the brink of ruin. There were a whole series of miscalculations with which he had very little to do.
Well, he refused to do anything. I mean, he was the
it's like
kind of
Lloyd
president who seemed
George
to like.
brought on yoga.
Well, just a moment.
Yeah.
Now, the country was rescued, partly rescued by Mr. Roosevelt. Now, let's go back to the 60s. Now, the 60s really started, I would suggest, or part of the turmoil started with the 1954 opinion, Brown versus Board of Education of the United States Supreme Court, because the average American, refused to accept the civil rights or defend the civil rights of the Negro and other minority groups. Now, you needed legislation as a catalyst. Now, you had the 1964, now may I finish?
Sure, I'm amused that you consider that legislation.
Now, you had the 1964 Act.
Mm-hmm.
And
64 Act.
64
Yeah.
Act, and then which incidentally was not just pushed through Congress, it was done with the greatest parliamentary finesse I've ever seen. Now, as a result of that legislation, the average American Negro is a reasonably free person. It's summed up in the slogan, black is beautiful. I mean, they have freed themselves. The American Negro is now just a welfare problem. He's not a civil rights problem. Now, that only came about because the federal government intervened after the Supreme Court. Now, you're suggesting all that should go.
Well, in the first place, there are 3 times as many Negroes on welfare now as there were in 1964, point one. Point two, the progress of the Negro, in my opinion, was not primarily the doing of the 64 Act or the 65 Act. It was a result of a series of economic motions that were set into play in the 19th century, precisely. Point three, to the extent that the 1964 Act merely applied and sought to enforce rights that the Negro had and was being deprived of, I quite agree with you that it was overdue. It didn't in fact need to be incorporated in the 1964 Act. It was the 14th Amendment that assigned to Congress responsibility for enforcing the rights of the black person.
Terribly well.
And then finally, point four, all I can say is that I'm in devoted agreement with you that the American Negro is free, and I wish you would talk to some of its leaders who continue to say that he's not free.
But the fact remains it needed federal intervention.
No.
It needed initiative from the White House to bring that about.
The fact
Not
is,
necessarily.
Mr. Buckley...
Not necessarily, because there was an evolution there that had taken place without the help of the Congress over a period of
Without
It needed
legislation,
federal troops to go down to the South.
you can often not persuade people to do the good and noble things that I'm sure you would have them do, but that you rather think they would do if they were not directed to do them.
I think by and large that's true, yeah.
You think that they would have got into universities in the South if it hadn't been for...
Well, Ms. Wells, let me put it this way. The 1964 Act, as you know, applied only to the South, i.e. the cutting edge. During the decade before 1964, there was mass emigration by substantial members of the black population from the South to the North. Now, having arrived at the North, where they had the equivalent of the 1964 Act, they weren't any freer by conventional standards than they are now. That is to say, they were still segregated. They still got the lowest paid jobs and so on and so forth. And to a certain extent, they still do. Now, I'm glad to say that we are working out of it slowly, but it has nothing to do with the 64 Act, in my opinion. No. The 65 Act, to the extent that it enfranchised the Negro who had been effectively disfranchised in the South, and in my opinion was absolutely overdue. This was a responsibility of the federal government, but it is not substantially correct, as I say, that the federal legislation freed the black man, as witness the fact that he had the benefit of that legislation for an entire decade in the North, but was
Yes.
according to his own witness, still
Indeed, indeed. No, it was a national thing. I don't level it all at the South. But can you name me a single instance in history where...
In 53?
No, in any history of any country where a large piece of enlightened progress has been made without legislation?
Yeah.
What?
The development of an attitude against lynching in the South. There were 3,000 lynchings on an average every 2 or 3 years at the turn of the century, and that had dwindled to maybe 1 every 2 or 3 years during the 50s, even though they had failed to pass an anti-lynching bill.
And what do you think caused that?
The development of an attitude. You know, Jefferson said that a people's attitudes are much more important than the laws. The laws are merely codifications of attitudes.
Yes, you can form people's attitudes by pointing out to them in law what is allowed in the law and what is against the law, as a matter of fact.
No, but in a democratic society, as I say, the law merely ratifies that which people are resolved to do in the first place, on the whole, yeah.
I find this absolutely fascinating
Yes.
because you're the first right-winger I have come across who takes a really rosy, optimistic view of human nature. You know as well as I do that the liberal sin is normally to consider that human beings are nicer than they are. And right-wingers come along and tell us they believe in original sin and you can't make people good and all the rest of it. Now what you're telling us is, left to themselves, they will do all these things that we're introducing these unnecessary bills to force them to do. And I just don't believe it, nor do I think really you believe it. What is your attitude to human nature, perfectibility of...
Well, I think
it's out of true with a lot of with the rest of your case and the rest of your beliefs.
No, I think that the sum total of human sinfulness is not likely to change in the aggregate, but it will take different forms. A typical sin of the 18th century was the excessive barbarism, let's say, of your penal laws. People can say, well, England has made progress, and the answer is it has made progress as regards penal laws, but has not necessarily made progress of all kinds. It may be like a balloon. You squeeze out this vice here, and the vice pops up somewhere else. In that sense, I think that the conservative intuition about human nature is unfortunately correct. We can say, I think, about the 20th century, that infinite improvements in any number of things are visible over against the 19th century, but it's been the worst century yet.
And laws have played no part. Laws have played no part in that.
As I say, laws I think of more or less as ratifications of human attitudes, and some laws are distinctively bad.
Yes, but it is often true, Mr. Buckley, that only a small group of people have the attitude to begin with, and they then agitate and try to reform something that is very bad, which the large bulk of people have not yet come to regard as bad. Would you not agree with that?
Yes, except I think that progress of this kind is usually made by what one used to be able to say without a snicker, the Lord's spiritual. And the Lord's spiritual were the people who were in charge of informing society concerning ethical distinctions. I want to get my ethics from my priest or my professor, but I certainly don't want to get it from the Congress of the United States.
No, but I don't mean the Congress of the United States. I mean any group of people that has seen a wrong and decided that it was wrong. Take England in the 19th century, your favorite century, when it was allowed for children to work in mines and in factories, extraordinarily long days, and with very little safeguard to their health or anything, yes? Now, only a small group of people saw this as bad. In fact, the large group of people, the people to whom it was an affront, the factory owners, said that the economic system would collapse, and they fought tooth and nail to prohibit the legislation being passed to get the children out of the mines and factories.
And your question is...
No, my question is that there's always a spearhead of a group of people, small usually, and usually what you would call liberal and no-goods, who see a wrong and who decide then to change attitudes.
Yes, but what made you suggest that it was a sitting member of Parliament who first decided that British youth were too scrawny and needed protection?
It was Lord Shaftesbury, in fact, who sacrificed his whole political career. He could easily have become Prime Minister if he'd gone along with waiting for people to change their attitudes. But he said, no, this is wrong, that kids should be sent up the chimneys to sweep them.
Well, but how do you account for the fact that a democratically elected, so-called, House of Parliament passed a law?
It took a long, hard fight.
Well, and your point is that you shouldn't wait that long, or what?
No. My point is that you should get the law passed, and then it is against the law to maltreat children or groups like Negroes. But you must
wait a
have the
minute,
law first.
Wasn't there a law against maltreating children before that?
No, there was a law against maltreating animals. That came first here.
It's also interesting to recall that American children were also working in mines and in factories for long hours, and it was only the British example that persuaded the United States to introduce a
I discovered a long time ago, when I became vice president of the Abortion Law Reform Association. In those days, it was a very dirty word. And women all over this country, and I dare say America then too, although it has much changed since then, thought that it was not a nice subject. But little by little, the little group of people whom I was aligned with worked, and the women spoke up and down the country, and there were articles in the paper, and finally, the women's groups, all of them in this country, a conservative bunch of ladies that I'm sure you would approve of, came around to seeing that the abortion law should be reformed. Now, this is how laws get reformed, and only until you reform a law.
I mean, your idea is to spare children the chance of the rigors of life by not permitting them to be born.
I don't think any child who is not wanted or ill-conceived or not willingly conceived.
Why don't you believe in infanticide?
No, this is a...
Miss Wells, may I suggest we don't get misled down that particular blind alley?
There's a sly process of co-option there.
My point is that there always must be the legislation or the change in legislation which comes before the change in attitude.
Very interesting point, because now you see, I think it's altogether possible that in the 21st century they will decide, just as we decided it was barbarous to deny the Jews and the Catholics a vote in the 19th century. It's altogether possible in the 21st century that they will say, do you realize that during the 20th century there are actually people around permitting abortion? Now we recognize that the unborn fetus has the same rights that a black man
we're not going to get off onto abortion.
Oh, you introduced it.
Mr. Buckley, let's move on a bit. Earlier you said that you would welcome Spiro Agnew as President of the United States.
Sure.
Would you like to tell us why?
Well, because I always measure my admiration of people to the extent to which they agree with me, and it's the easiest test, by and large. Mr. Agnew, I think, is conservative, and right on most issues. Excuse me?
Is that enough?
Well, it's the best you can do in an imperfect world.
Necessary but not sufficient, I would think, even from your point of view.
I don't agree with him about everything, but that's.
Mr. Nixon is not a conservative, is that right?
Well,
why do you choose one against the other?
Mr. Nixon has always considered himself a centrist, and it may very well be that a centrist was what America needed there for a while. I tend to think that the quality of the lowering crises in America call for very forthright recommendations by somebody who gets his inspiration primarily from the political right. And I think that Mr. Agnew would tend to do that a little bit more than Mr. Nixon.
But if Mr. Nixon's a centrist, he must have a very portable centre.
Oh, sure, all centrists do. You measure from here to here, and you're halfway. And that's what a centrist is defined as.
So he was a centrist when he was, the anti-communist leader.
Yeah, he was halfway between, say, Joe McCarthy and Jack Kennedy, who were together at that point, and let's say Adlai Stevenson.
Do you think there is a case for abolishing all the things that have been lumped together in a sort of euphemistic thing called dirty tricks? Do you think that there could be a way to run a moral election?
Probably not. I think that certain mechanical aids are desirable, and we have a lot to learn from you all over here about the brevity of elections. I think that's extremely important.
But if you say probably not, and I'm sure you believe that, then how can you possibly pin your faith on people changing their attitudes? I just think you'd be for more and more and more tight legislation to make sure that things were run in a moral fashion, honestly.
Well, I am. I think that there should be very, very full disclosure of all contributions, that kind of thing. And to the extent possible, less money should be spent. And the best way to do that, of course, is to shorten the period. But this is very hard to do in a free society. If George McGovern says, I'm going to run for president, starts campaigning 3 years before the Miami, somebody's got to limp around and listen to what he has to say, and he gets in the news, and the campaign hasn't, for all intents and purposes, begun.
Yes, but of course the incumbent president is campaigning 4 years before the thing actually gets going, too, for his second term.
Well, but sometimes there isn't an incumbent president who's up for re-election.
True.
Mr. Buckley, how does your country recover from Watergate? Will it be done by Mr. Agnew, or do you need some kind of constitutional amendment which will reassert?
I don't think, Mr. Heren, I don't think that anybody has proposed a constitutional amendment as suited to take care of any problems of this character. Now, some people have said, well, let's limit financial contributions to say $2,000 per person. Other people have said, in order to do that, you're going to need a constitutional amendment because the contribution of money is an aspect of free speech. If I want to buy a page in the London Times or say the New York Times and say, I want everybody to vote for so-and-so because he takes such and such a position, am I, because this page costs $10,000, spending money primarily, or am I exercising my right to free speech primarily? These problems may have to be settled in a constitutional amendment, but I doubt that one could go through abridging the First Amendment for that purpose. Therefore, I think probably we'll have to settle for legislative reforms.
Well, I'm glad you accept the need for legislation at times, but do you think that a change in electoral laws would be sufficient?
No, I don't. Incidentally, that is a movement whose day has passed. Everybody was talking about it 4 or 5 years ago, and deep research into it convinced, I think, most people that it would be a sundering instrument rather than the reverse. They might at some point play with the idea of a runoff. If you have a George Wallace type situation with a third party, they might play with a runoff, but that would require a constitutional amendment. I don't think there's anything about to happen to America by way of constitutional sunburst that is going to make things a whole lot better. But this slight revision of attitude, I think, will emerge as the datum that occupies the attention of the historian.
I don't think there's anything, you say, I don't think there's anything that's about to happen. I have the impression that there isn't anything you want to happen, that the present mood of the American people suits you very well.
No, it doesn't at all. I think the American people are being much too sleepy.
Dreams shattered. You don't hate people having dreams. You hate them having aspirations, having all these stamped under feet.
Well, we're on a big high with the Soviet Union, I'll tell you that right now. I'd like to see that dream shattered. And that trip may last right into impotency if we don't watch out.
Yeah.
And this may be the great delinquency of President Richard Nixon, that he allowed it to happen. And 4 or 5 years from now, we'll be in a situation vis-à-vis the Soviet Union in which they will simply dominate the politics of the world.
That one will then go sour too. You'll be a very happy man.
No, I'm not the least happy at the prospect of being satirized by the Soviet Union.
No, what I'm trying to get at is that if you don't believe in ideals in politics, then the present condition of the American people must be one that to you is not altogether unwelcome. What you're really against is things like you're against sort of ramparts in the world of on the walls of freedom. You're against peace corps. You're against all what you regard as bogus idealism in politics. And I'd have thought this has been an extremely good year for you.
I'm very much in favor of personal idealism.
Personal idealism.
Yeah, but I'm against the kind of idealism that sees the government as the indispensable vehicle for that idealism. Now, obviously, the government's got to hire the Navy. We're not going to have a hire purchase Navy.
Yeah.
But we've got to have a Navy the government pays the bills for. But beyond that, I see absolutely no logic to much of the idealism that is now structured into the government.
Would you feel the same if you weren't, to put it as sometimes it's put over here, if you weren't one of those who live on the top of the heap? It's always seemed to be very easy for people who can run their own lives to say, well, I'm against government interference. I don't think government should infringe on this kind of activity. And if you lived your life at the bottom of the pile, I often think you'd have a different view.
Well,
you'd need to go to the Social Security.
I can, of course, answer you that question statistically, which is that there is no significant economic differential in the supporters of Goldwater and the supporters of Kennedy.
In the economic backgrounds.
That's right.
But for you, don't you come to, if I were you, I would wonder whether I took this view because it was a view that suited me personally. This doesn't worry you late at night.
That's because you probably spent too much of your life being lectured to by behaviorists and
I think
economic determinists.
one of the saddest things that happens...
It's never even occurred to me that might happen.
One of the very sad things that happens to people like you, I mean, that's very loosely speaking, who are rather against idealistic people who would like to create even a little chunk of utopia somewhere.
I'm in favor of idealistic people.
I see, but individuals, you don't want them in any little busy do-gooding groups.
You want them in kind of,
right, especially little do-gooding groups that are against the kind of things that, right.
Setting up abortion factories.
But it's, yeah, I know, right. But then, of course, you don't have to have abortions, do you? But leave that aside. seems to me that people like you often lose something that seems to me almost the most important of all, which is compassion. You don't reckon in terms of human happiness or dignity or health or how the people on the bottom of the heap, as Tony says, are going to struggle when obviously they're not as good at it as we are. This is an unequal world.
No, I think we're rather well-mannered about avoiding exhibitionistic temptations. I don't think that because Mossadegh wept more than Eisenhower, he was a more compassionate man.
I don't mean that. I don't mean that at all,
than,
Mr. Buckley. Don't let's get sidetracked onto that. No, I don't mean that. I mean that whenever you, I mean, I've heard people talk like you before. I'm always astonished that you can believe what you claim to believe, and I'm only taking it on faith that you're not teasing us. You're not teasing us. I do think that's probably true. But in your piece, for instance, when you wrote about the great fuss about bombing the dikes in North Vietnam, you said, I think you said, that it should have been done before because it would have been a very fine instrument against the agricultural policy of North Vietnam.
No, I didn't say that. No, I said it would have spared the Vietnamese and us a lot of misery.
Well, you can't know that, and it would have caused untold misery.
I can't know anything in that sense.
Well, you wrote it as if you knew it, and you're saying it now as if you know it.
Can we know when Churchill says that if you all had moved against Hitler at the time of the Anschluss, the Second World War wouldn't have happened? No. It may be that he can't know that, but I find it a cogent point of view.
Miss Wells, no, it really has pointed to a very important thing, compassion. Perhaps you can answer this question for me as an American Catholic. The Catholic Church basically is a very compassionate religion. Why is it that the American Catholics are so hard, so right-wing?
Like Kennedy? Like Kennedy?
There are about, 45, 50 million
like Muskie?
Catholics in the United States.
Well, who do you mean? Like me, you mean? But in the first place, they're not all that right-wing. They've always voted in great numbers for the Democratic Party, unfortunately. They're growing up, but that has been their habitual attitude. Wasn't it you who told me about Lord Bryce a moment ago and how the Irish voted for the Democrats, even in the 19th century?
So why are you
but
not
in fact, the
compassionate?
Catholic Church, I mean, compare it to the English or the French or the Dutch, is a very, very... The American Catholic Church is a very right-wing church. I mean, they were against a partial test ban treaty until Pope John said it was okay. They're against anything which can be labeled communistic. It seems to be unthinking, rough and tough, selfish religion.
I think that anybody who is compassionate would definitely be against anything that was communistic. We have only to survey the performance of communism in the world.
I said labeled communistic, like having a national health service is supposed to be.
Well, you're confusing it if you're saying that they believe something to be communist, which in fact you know isn't. But something which is communist, they tend to be opposed to, and I think this is proof abundant of their compassion.
They've played the red bogey, in fact.
Yes, and they played the red bogey to avoid what I would think
what red bogey?
Compassionate acts.
What red bogey? What red bogey?
Why? Because they label necessary reforms, such as their National Health Service, as socialistic, creeping socialism.
Well, it is socialistic. Of course it's socialistic.
But
the morning's papers here in London show that as recently as yesterday, the Soviet Union was beating up Jews. Now, is that a red bogey that beat them up?
No, we're not talking about
but now,
that.
Mr.
What are we talking about? What are we talking about? What are we talking about?
Oh, we're talking about the communistic labels, which are.
I don't think we're going to get anywhere with Mr. Buckley on that.
Because the Tsar beat up Jews too.
We're not going to do. No. I know.
No, but we're against SARS too.
But now, this label of socialistic, Mr. Buckley, you agree, I'm sure, that there should be free education in America as in other places, yes? The school system.
But I don't believe that the federal government has any role.
Right, okay, but it should be free education, right? Now, that's a very socialist concept, isn't it? You also believe, I'm sure, that the highway should be free.
Now, wait a minute. It's not a socialist concept unless you want to say that having common drinking water is also a socialist concept. The point is that,
some situations,
the point is that we have traditionally denied the franchise to anybody who couldn't read. Under the circumstances, there is an obligation to see to it that they're in how to read. I'm afraid the time is up, but thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
For a printed bound copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Could we have the lights up, please, Brian, for photographs? We'll just do some publicity photographs while we're here. We're used to the heat.
Sit down now.
Oh, yes, please. We're just waiting for them to clear the recording, so you know, to check the tape and make sure they've got something on.